All right. That's what I'm talking about. All right. Before I hit record, though, I'm going to take a selfie with us.
Okay.
So I'm going to put you, but still, you shouldn't say anything horribly filthy. Because, hold on. I'm going to turn me off so y'all are bigger on the screen.
Got to do the shaka.
Well, you're cracking me up, man. This is a good start.
Yeah. I was telling Tripp that part of the reason that Tripp and I are friends is because of you, Greg. I didn't know if you knew it, with the STEAM grant and us, I met Tripp at one of his podcasts and I mentioned faith and science. His eyes lit up and we kind of started geeking out on Star Wars stuff and faith and science stuff and did some events. So thanks, Greg. Thanks for opening that door for.
Yeah. I mean, I want to say you're welcome, but I feel like, man, there's so much more that emerged from that grant. So that's very cool.
He's going to decide if he wants to take credit for anything when we get done. He's like, well, I got to think about this first.
Reserving judgment is a matter of infinite hope. That's what F. Scott Fitzgerald once said. So I'm gonna lean on that.
Hey, if Greg,
yeah,
can you go to the audio thing and see if you can turn yourself up a smidge? It might just be me, but
yeah, I mean, on the let's see,
it's a little really poor. Oh, hi. How would you pronounce Petr?
Peter, maybe.
I know, but
Pater.
Oh, I see what you're looking at. You're looking at that. I got you. Let me see if I get the mic a little closer.
Okay, try that.
Ooh, West Palm Beach. Nice. I was down in South Florida for a while, a little bit, down in Boca.
Let's try that. No, it's not very loud, is it? Huh.
If you're on the stream, how does it sound? Because that is the main variable. But you see the little gizmo in the bottom right underneath the screen that that settings one?
Yeah.
If you hit that and then go to audio.
Yeah.
Do you have the right mic and everything selected? Check that, your audio input, and then if it is if you go to advanced settings or whatever where it gets you these little tick things, there's an auto gain control.
Yeah.
There you go.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think my mic wasn't even hooked up to the system. So
I mean, you just got a lot thicker voice. I mean, I'm much more likely to believe you right now.
What if I get really close like
this? That's even better.
Radio voice.
All right. So it's pronounced like Peter, just without the second E. It's the Russian Ukrainian spelling. So now we know. You know what G.I. Joe told me?
Tell me.
Knowing is half the battle. Knowing. Jeez, come on.
That might deserve a sound effect. Yeah.
I was just listening to you today with Pete Enns, and you were doing that the whole time. I was like, can I get that too?
Yeah.
Oh, you can get it too. But you know what else? Since Will's here, I can actually use my special soundboard.
Oh, boy.
The one our mutual friend Nick sent, which I may have to switch it back after this because, but it includes not an air horn, but the horn of Gondor.
Oh, yeah.
Gosh.
It also has really fun things from Lord of the Rings on it.
It comes in paints.
Pints. Cheers.
Pints. Yes.
I'm going on an adventure.
So
Greg gave me a private tour of Sierra Nevada's brewery there in Asheville, North Carolina. He had connections, and when he came and spoke to the North Carolina Lutherans at our synod conference, he brought me over there, and that was good times. That was good.
That was really fun.
Yeah.
The architect who did that design for that building was from Chico, where I live. So that's pretty cool.
I'm a fan.
I'm still kind of geeking out in the Lord of the Rings stuff. I don't know if you have I don't think he knows about Second Breakfast, Pip.
Oh, look, if you want, that is not good for us promoting your book or what you're doing at connecting science and the church, which is really cool, and that's what we're hoping to promote here. But if you would like detours into Middle Earth, let's just say the reason I sent you the link about 5 minutes before we started is because I'm reading The Hobbit to my two youngest at night, and I've lost track of time because they were about to find at the end of autumn when the thrust is beating the snail against the rock, and then as the sun goes and the new moon cracks up, and then the key opens, and is Thorin gonna get up in time? And oh, it's 8:53. Good night. I love you. Y'all do the Lord's Prayer together.
That's right.
So,
Trip, I didn't get that link, and I didn't see that I'm not supposed to be on Safari, but I actually am on Safari right now.
well,
should I
if you get weird, we'll tell you, because it is it's weird. I heard Safari was doing an update where it wouldn't, but sometimes it just gets weird. All right, so I'm gonna hit record.
All right.
But our friends joining live, you see, they get to experience what happens before we hit record. Ooh.
That's right.
Oh yeah, hello, homebrewed Christianity listeners. Today, well, if you're joining live, you just heard the air horn, and Eric Tate, who's in the live stream, his wife hates the air horn. I've heard that from people, but also when I don't use it on a live stream, people are like, "You forgot the air horn." Mm-hmm. So it's a hard thing, but I'll try not to hit it again unless Greg, who's here to hang out with Will and I, brings up Middle Earth again. Then it might happen. But he is the author of a brand new book, Science and Religions in America, a new look. It's quite a one. Religion science books, not normally easy to read, not normally, even if they're labeled like for a general audience or an introduction, wonderfully accurate. But this one is fascinating because it's not just like, well, let me tell you the science that you never actually learned in high school. It's what is America's diverse religious experience, from the different religious traditions to the spiritual but not religious, the atheist. How does the conversation of religion in America, religion science in America, play out, and what can we learn from it if we frame it in a broader way rather than on the terms that the academy has in so much of the West as Christianity engaging science and religion, and we have some of our other monotheistic friends around. But it's a wonderful book, excellent to use if you want to learn more about the subject. You're hanging out with undergrad classes. It is short enough they might finish it, which is always an important feature. But it will. Who those of you that are regulars on the podcast will know Will Rose, usually here because we're talking about comic books, science fiction, things like that.
Star Wars.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know, and we're 2 days early for Star Wars Day, but
Star Wars week.
But we have one of our other shared loves is religion and science. Mm-hmm. And Will, Lutheran minister, has a science and religion group at his church just as much as he has a God Loves Geeks group. And that was really the connection for people looking at how communities of faith can engage the sciences. So since Will is the matchmaker of getting Greg on here, and since the announcement for this came out, the volume of mutual friends Greg and I have is about 35 just in personal messages. Mm-hmm. Will, why don't you introduce Greg, and as a clergy kind of set up who Greg is, but also in the context of a lot of people here that are listening who go like, I'd love to engage science and religion in my congregation or my reading group and that kind of thing. But what does that look like?
Yeah, so I met Greg. What year did the STEAM grant come out?
2016.
Yeah, way back in the before times. So like 2016, we had a group of so my context for ministry is in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, University of North Carolina, Holy Trinity Lutheran Church. Some of your listeners came to Theology Beer Camp. We hung out in my church and on campus and frequented Franklin Street for food and breweries. And so my context is not only with lifelong Lutherans, but also with students from UNC, but also professors who work at UNC. And even before I met Greg, there have been science professors who are members of my church, whether they're evolutionary biologists, or we even have a professor who is emeritus of physics at Duke, who works at CERN and helped discover the God particle, the Higgs boson, Professor Goshaw. And so we started, even before I got to the church, they were always engaged in like the big questions, philosophy, theology, science, integration of vocation at the university, and also faith. But there was a large contingent of scientists, professors as well, who did some panels and did some book discussions. And we had a book group going around. Al Goshaw, Dr. Goshaw, start us on a book study around faith and science. And then somebody's email, someone who's getting their doctorate in astrophysics at UNC, an email came across from which seminary was that, Greg?
It's from Fuller.
From Fuller.
We housed it at Fuller, yeah.
Because Sari was the one that sent the email.
Yeah, yeah. So our mutual friend, Sari, STEAM grant, Science and Theology for Emerging Adult Ministries, in a way that you can engage science in your congregation, with young adults that they labeled emerging adults. And so we applied, got it, and then was able to like engage in this grant process. And it helped us really go deeper into, we had the resources, we had professors, we had people really interested, but what the grant did is allowed us to kind of really open many other doors and other resources to go deeper into the conversation around faith and science. And Greg was a big part of that grant and leader in that project. I met him through there, and then the ongoing relationship with that. So really that helped kind of fund us going deeper, and then eventually led to me meeting Tripp and doing a couple events at the church and live podcasts. At one point, we did an event where God loves science and science fiction, and in the midst of that day workshop, the electricity went out. So we had to do a podcast by candlelight.
Oh yeah,
we called it "Why God Loves Science but Hates Electricity." That was the name of.
Why is it the technology always breaks down?
Yeah,
when you talk about science and religion.
Exactly. But Greg is a Presbyterian minister and pastor, and also teaches. What's your official title at your
lecturer? Yeah, in the Department of Comparative Religion and Humanities at Chico State,
and does some undergrad and graduate level courses in faith and science. Has done research along with the grant process, and has written a number of books. And so when this book came out, and now is working not only continuing to teach undergrads and pastor and do ministry, but he's now part of Science for the Church is a project. And how would you label that? It's like a resource for churches and congregations that help congregations who aren't necessarily on the doorstep of a university or have Nobel Peace Prizing physicists in the congregation to like help congregations engage in faith and science, the important issue, because really that's the vitality of the church. The future of the church really is how we handle and wrestle with and engage in science. And I'll just share my kind of the testimony. I've done some work with faith science before, but with this STEAM grant, it was really one of the most engaging, enriching projects I've ever been a part of in ministry. And it's because of the relationships that open up and help us go deeper in the questions. So I can't speak I can't speak enough about how much I respect that work and Greg's work in that and what he continues to do. So this book, when it came out, I was like, Tripp, we got to get together and talk about it. And then the reason I'm here is that, I don't have a PhD in science. In fact, I made a C in marine biology at the University of Wilmington. I thought
it was just so you could go surf, Will?
Yeah. I majored in marine biology thinking I was just going to play with dolphins and surf. I made a C in my lab and said, maybe I should do something else. But it's ironic or providential that I've been lured over to more faith and science in terms of engaging ministry. And so it's been very enriching with the relationships and questions are engaged. So being an everyday man or just a pastor in a local parish, it does have a major effect and it really enriches your your ministry in the local parish. So thanks, Greg. That's a long story,
Yeah.
but glad that you're here, and you and Tripp can meet and geek out. And I'll just chime in. I read your book as well, and can't recommend enough. So good job.
Well, Will, thank you. I just want to say your friendship is really such an encouragement to me, and just really enjoy it. And besides that, Holy Trinity was one of the star sites for science and theology for emerging adult ministries, and it continues to be. That's the great thing. Like, you just keep it going.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate what you do. Yeah. You exemplify that interaction and why it's important.
Yeah.
So, Greg, this book is really good, and it's very clear to me that the question around science and religion, that you have this wonderful laboratory called Talking About It to undergrad students and clergy.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd love for you to share a bit about the origin story of this book with reference to the challenges you come up with or have come up with because of those two unique settings: regular engagement in the congregation and with clergy, and then in the classroom with undergrad students at a state school in California, which is its own vibe. As someone who was a youth minister and taught religion in North Carolina and then moved to Los Angeles, it's its own vibe.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, the book really came out of a request from my students. I started teaching. I was asked to go to Chico State to teach science and religion in fall of 2014. And I kept using some really good texts. And as I taught, my students kept asking me, can we get something that isn't just about Christianity and science, or atheism and science, or atheism in particular that's posed against Christianity, but can we have a more multi-religious approach? And essentially that's why I wrote the book. I could not find anything else that would really speak to my undergrads. There are some really great academic books. Brooke and Numbers have this great book, Religion Around the World, Science and Religion Around the World, and that's amazing, but it's way different from the questions that my students are asking. So it's basically, the hundreds of students that I've had every semester I've been teaching since fall of 2014, this has been tested with them. It's the questions they ask, it's the issues they face. And the way I even organized the book was in the order of what I found to be the most important religious traditions for them. So the 7 different traditions I look at. As far as being a pastor, I started in New York City as my first calling, right in Midtown Manhattan. And I just finished a PhD in religion and science at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. And I tried to bring that to I did bring it to my congregation. And I found that people were actually really interested in the topic. So, that was 1996. So since then, I've just been bringing this topic of faith and science to the congregations I've been a part of. Naturally in the church, they're a little more interested in Christian spirituality and science or Christian theology. And outside in the secular university, where just under half of my students identify as Christian, there's more interest in, exploring other traditions. And yet I just presented this book a few months ago to my congregation in Chico, and they were really interested in it. So it shows that people are fascinated by various spiritual traditions, A, and then B, how do they engage with this modern world, which has so much science and technology that just is a part of almost everything we do.
Yeah. Okay. So here, one of the things I just want to say up front, because a lot of my friends who teach religion and science classes listen to podcasts. Having taught the second half of our year-long class of religion and science at the University of Edinburgh a number of times, I'll just say I wish this was the book, because most of the religion science conversation in the academy is framed where some version of Orthodox Christianity that actually likes science. So there's lots of cool, like, let's use Wittgenstein in language games, or Karl Barth, or there's lots of ways of just not caring. Well, they may not use that phrase, but I do. But if you engage it, there's like ways of being a classical theist that are Thomist, ways of doing it with like Kant with a little third critique thrown in or whatever. And then there's like the angry militant atheist version, and we like science. And almost all the things we got stuck using are either ancient stuff from Anglo traditions or a battle where you just assume that reason and the facts of science will settle it. And either you'll be a classical theist or a reductive atheist, both of which I hate professionally and aesthetically. So one of the gifts I think the book does, by putting all these different religious traditions and the way they engage science next to each other, and taking seriously the diversity of those that are known as the nuns and their religious spiritual question, their questions, is to say that to ask the question of religion and science today, where our whole public square is included, it actually becomes a more lively conversation where questions of meaning, truth, value, beauty get reintroduced in the public square, where in our normal framing of classical Orthodox theism, Christianity with its tag-along friends in the West, and militant atheism, make it like we'd rather just be value neutral because those are allergic and off-putting. And so I hope everyone that ever does religion and science understands that Greg has demonstrated how much cooler it is to actually hang out with all the religious traditions and take the different expressions of the nuns and atheists seriously, and avoid God-splainers who reduce everything and cultivate certainty and then sell it to us. That is why this book's awesome, and you should all go get it, because it's also, you can read it. Well, not everyone's a speed reader, but you can read it rather quickly. It's not like reading almost any of the other religion science intro books. So,
and I would say like the resources that like our STEAM grant gave us is like, it just, I knew there were books around faith and science. I knew there were some leading authors, and a lot of them do come out as like huge, thick textbooks. Like, when do I have the time to kind of wrestle through all this? This is short, sweet, to the point. But also, I think this particular book is also like, it lets me know as a parish pastor and as a Christian to say that we aren't the only ones who are wrestling with this question. They're all the religions, all the faiths, no faiths, spiritual, not religious. They're all wrestling with, how does science match up with our beliefs, with our practice, with my understanding of the world, and how God fits into that. So for me, it was almost pastoral in the fact that I'm like, I'm not the only one personally, but also my church isn't the only one. My tradition is the only one. My whole religion is not the only one. All religions are wrestling with this, and some do it well, some don't do well. Some bury their heads in the sand and try to ignore it, but it's not going away, which is why we were dedicated at Holy Trinity to like, look, these questions aren't going anywhere, so we might as well face them, answer them, wrestle with them together, and it will indeed enrich how we express ourselves in the world and how we express our faith. So that kind of understanding of those seven main ones, not all of them, but there are some there. So yeah, I take comfort that we're not.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that makes me, really excited about this interchange is part of what I learned back to my PhD when I studied Alfred North Whitehead and process philosophy. And this whole idea of this is how Michael Velker, a theologian, described it: a polycontextual and multi-perspectival view of the world. Big words, but it means like there's all these perspectives, and you don't prioritize one. I mean, that's what Whitehead was trying to do. How do you see all of them creating the world in which we have whatever? In his Whitehead's language is relative actual worlds. These places where we discuss and interchange on important topics. And I have found using that model is just incredibly helpful, because there's something about the richness that comes out of this. You know what I mean? It's not, you're not down one track trip, like you said, or two tracks that are kind of on a collision course. But you have this ability to, interchange. So I mean, I've particularly been interested by the nuns because I grew up, even though I'm probably too old for this, I grew up in the Bay Area and was part of a nun family. That was not, the standard way people thought of growing up in the 70s, but my family was not religious. The people I grew up with were not religious. writers for Hollywood, people who went off and did music for a career, people who did other kinds of things. Anyway, just to say, like, that whole approach to life, and then the kind of pluralism that goes along with it, is always fascinated me. And so I wanted this conversation about religion and science, or religion and science, or spirituality and science, to have that kind of feel to it. And I'll just say one more thing about the book, which helped me to get over the fear of trying to represent religions or spiritual traditions that I didn't know as well. And in each chapter, I interviewed somebody, or even two people, just to make sure, like, was I asking the right questions? Were these the questions that a Muslim would ask? And then to make sure that I represented them fairly. I do have learned a lot from Karl Barth. And one of the things he said about when you represent somebody else's perspective is they should be looking over your shoulder and nodding in agreement. And I wanted that to be the feel of each chapter. So I'm hoping, that it sounds like there's been some resonance there, but I hope that it starts a dialogue. I hope this is not the ending. I hope there's more people that have much more to say that can get into it.
Well, yeah, okay. So you have to answer this question in multiple contexts, and it's at the beginning of your book. Now, most people that have not taken a religious class will be like, well, that shouldn't take long. Those that do know, there are whole things dedicated to it, and possibly a qualifying exam essay at GTU. So could you tell us how would you define religion and science when, right, you're not trying to define them so that some specific version of one tradition or answer to religion wins, and some particular account of science is the ultimate and final one? Like, when you have engaged the sciences vocationally, been nested in a confessional tradition, but learned, interviewed, asked, seek to try to articulate the wisdom of a multiplicity of traditions, how would you define science and religion in ways that it generates this kind of all the possibilities, I think, that start to get expressed in the book, and I hope that the field kind of adopts as its working framework.
Yeah, Trip, that's a key question, and one that I kept returning to. I'll start with definitions that I began with, right? So for science, I talked about knowledge about or study of the natural world, framed in theories based on observation, which are tested through experimentation. And then for religion, I have a very complicated definition I put together from the different people that I've studied over the years. So this is not my definition per se, it's a composite definition. The belief in God, or in many gods, or ultimate reality, as well as an organized system of beliefs, ceremonies, sacred stories, and ethical guidelines used to relate to God, a plurality of gods, or ultimate reality. And in that second definition, I often turn to Stephen Prothero, who wrote this great book. He's really a mentor in style, meaning how to write well, for me. And he talks about the 4 C's of studying religion: creed, that is what you believe; code, that is your morals; community, who you're with; and then cultus, which you all know is a kind of technical word meaning worship. So creed, cultus, code, and community. Now, having said that, it's really important to recognize that science, as I'm talking about it, is framed by modern science as defined by the European scientific revolution. We usually associate with the 16th and 17th century. So already every religious tradition I looked at had some questions about that. And maybe we'll talk about how much of science was used for colonialism and other kinds of ills, eugenics, and so on, that we don't want to be about, right? And then religion is a really tricky term. I think science, in terms of the way I've studied it and people I've read in the philosophy of science, it has a lot of complexity to it. It gets more complex when you put it in various cultural contexts. But religion is even more difficult. And when I first started teaching religion as a topic in a comparative religion department, it was actually almost a little, despairing to realize There's no one great organizing definition. And one of the examples I used is from the Columbia anthropologist Severin Fowles, who studies the Southwest Pueblo Native Americans. And he says that the word in Tiwa, I believe it's Tiwa, for religion is doings. In other words, religion is not seen as something separate from life. Like there's the sacred and the profane. It's like all about what we do in our life. And so there are points where I almost felt like I wanted to give up. I wanted to have that academic complexity, but I felt like, well, I'm going to start with these definitions. There'll be a nice way to begin. And then as I go through it, I can show in which way we need to, vary those and nuance them and all that sort of thing. And so that's what I did. And I hope those definitions work for people as a starting point, at least.
Well, and I think religion in science and in most kind of like master signifiers for a giant multiplicity and pluralistic overlapping communities of seeking something, right? There is a sense that people learn what the word means through family resemblance. Mm-hmm. And so some religious traditions may have these features or these, but if they're all hanging out, you'd be like, well, I guess that works for religion. And science is similar because the social sciences and what that looks like is different than what a classical physicist does. And then like the quantum physicists sound closer sometimes to poets, but they use math. And then like there's all these variations, but I do think that like having specific enough definitions to include those communities that want to be included so they feel heard, mm-hmm. and exclude the overwhelming majority are like, no, that's not us. Right. Like a lot of Christians will be like, oh, no. Well, have you heard about young earth creation science? And then like scientists are like, no, it doesn't work. And they may want to use the label, but you're like, no, we're not that postmodern. And so I actually find like the kind of I feel like your definitions work well because it's like bowling with bumpers. Like a lot of space is available. Some of them are strikes. Some of them may hit a pin or whatever, but we're just trying to avoid gutter balls because gutter balls are when science goes ugly or religion goes ugly. It's like a cult or the person that's like, the earth's flat, right? Right. And I think that's helpful.
Once, by the way, in a science and religion conversation, like, let's talk about flat Earth. I'm thinking, oh my god, no, actually, and also that the sun goes around the earth or whatever. I'm like, no, I don't think we're going there.
I know. I'll chime in and just say that, like, starting off with definitions, like our project that we did with the church is we found that like we're going to start this by asking what we mean by the certain terms. So like when you walk in a room, you're like, let's talk about faith and science. Well, what do you mean by faith? What do you mean by science? Well, let's talk about God. Well, what do you mean by God? Because there's a lot of definitions out there. What do you mean by that? And so what do you mean by science? And all right, let's come up with some common terms and a definition we can all agree upon before we talk about the tension between the two or how they can work together in the same sandbox. And so what I appreciate about your book is defining those terms, but also in the back, there's these glossary of terms you can go to as a quick reference point. And then each chapter within these religions you lift up have almost like a liturgical flow to it, and that you ask a question, a Q&A, then you have a reflection, and then you define terms and you move on to the next one. So that it helps you go through this. So I really think if anybody out there wants to go in their congregations or community to do some conversations around faith and science in their faith communities, first spend some time with just the words themselves. Don't jump into the deep questions and we're going to solve it and have an answer by the end of like this 3-hour workshop. No, let's take some time with the word itself and have a common understanding and agreement with what we mean by that. Then let's talk about the big questions that are out there that everyone's wrestling with.
You think clarity helps communication well? Sometimes. I would think assent does.
Yeah.
Hashtag true religion and true science. So Greg, when you investigate multiple religious traditions and then like see the nuns and such as they're which is the second largest religious community in America, religious identifier or whatever. Which, if people are interested, May 23rd or whatever the Tuesday is in that week, Ryan Burge, who wrote the book called The Nuns and collects all the data, we're doing a webinar, so he'll explain it, and I'll probably ask
So
this.
great.
So you can all come hang out. I'm sure I'll put a link up soon once I finish building the website tomorrow. But as someone who has investigated this connection in multiple traditions, and it exists in a religious community and the academic one, what is the Venn diagram for people's most pressing questions? Right? Are there particular questions that say, monotheistic traditions ask that maybe traditions were ultimate realities, not personal, or like an agential one, don't ask? Are there ones that are more prominent for people grounded in Eastern traditions, or for the nuns? Like, if you were to take like the 3 most important religion science conversations for these different groups and make a Venn diagram, what do you think you would learn from it? Like, what are the more pressing ones that pull a multiplicity of communities to the table, where this framework you've given could really be generative?
I love that. Well, I mean, I think I've been influenced a lot by teaching sociology at the university, and how we're formed by the social group that we're in, and therefore what are the human and anthropological questions that emerge. So at the end of the day, without ultimately resolving theology's anthropology like Feuerbach did, I do think we naturally come to questions about spirituality and religion through what is important to us. And so I would say that, for a Buddhist, I think there's a really strong sense of wanting to be awakened, and awakened from the veil of ignorance, into which the Buddha, of course, his name means the awakened one and enlightened one. I prefer awakened one, which we could talk about, but that awakening to what is true, right? And then also the awakening to how do we come to a point where we have, right mindfulness, right action, that whole Eightfold Path, that's part of Buddhism. So I think in a lot of ways, again, to summarize, 7% of the world's population, I think for a Buddhist, there's that sense of wanting to find what works in this world. I think there's a very practical side to a Buddhist approach to science and to what spirituality as it relates to that. I think I'm very interested in the nuns, like you were talking about, or the spiritual but not religious, and those terms I think are getting greater clarity, but I believe we're on the edge of something that's not really well defined. So that's a little bit of the problem we have. By the way, I think our common friend Sarah Lane Ritchie is doing some really good work with creating a team to look at this more, with more detail. And I've also learned a lot from Elaine Howard Eklund. But just to say that I think the spiritual but not religious, what I get out of that group, like talking to high schoolers a couple of weeks ago about this book and the ideas, is how do I find a place that my spiritual life connects with this world around me? And I think what I'm, again, so it's again, very existential, personal question. What's the group I'm going to be with to find this? And what I see in the spiritual but not religious, among other things, is how can I draw from various spiritual traditions and create a bricolage, an assembly of different inputs, or what I like to think of as like a Spotify playlist that brings in different ideas, different artists, different traditions, even at a different point in my life, to create happiness, to create, a soul comfort. And for a lot of spiritual but not religious, they have been wounded by traditional religion, which of course in our country is primarily Christianity, but of course it can have other components to it. I think for Christians, I hate to simplify still 65% of our population, but I would say that at some level it comes down to what does this mean for my life and my community. So when people, in my experience of working with a question that always comes up in science and religion for Christians, which is evolution and creation, or evolution and origins, or those sorts of things, at the end of the day, what I have found is people want to know that the scripture that they're leaning into can be trusted, so that when they are depressed, when their marriage is falling apart, when they are looking for, some response to finding joy and contentment in the world, that this Bible will help me find it. And so what happens, I think, with evolution, it says, well, as I've been taught the Bible, this problematizes that. And I don't really like that. If there's no Adam and Eve, that's what evolution teaches, then what about this Savior in Jesus that is going to help me make it through the day? So I think it's, Stephen Prothero says, "Saved from sin" is the slogan for Christians. In a way, it's saved from those things that tear us apart so that we can be whole in our faith, in our relationship with God, and relationship with one another. If I just would add one more thing, I think you could summarize all this as say, all the religions in different ways do work with this idea of human flourishing, happiness, beauty. Those are terms which to me create a central mode in which many of the questions are answered and responded to in different ways.
Okay. So the last bit, I don't know if we'll come back to this. I just want to put a pin in it that this is part of a long argument I've had with usually physicists in religion and science conversation, is that religion and science, if you aren't an apologist, is largely aesthetic and plausibility. That religion and science has to do, like the things you just listed would all be in the category aesthetic or beauty, right? Like if you think of the questing for truth as truth, if you are an apologist, you go for truth, whether you're a God-splainer on the atheist or particular religious tradition side, or let's say you're a good Kantian and you think that's above your pay grade. Now science is an asset because you have a puzzle. I'm sorry for my friends that get grants doing that. And now you're going to assume your confessional tradition and use science to settle a question for your morality police or between your confessional traditions, doctrinal things. But beauty is a whole different question. And I think most humans are driven by beauty, which doesn't mean that is the best way to frame like questions about ultimate reality, but it is what most people, they ask aesthetic questions before they ask good and true. And the thing I find helpful about that is that when almost anyone is asked a beauty question, your defense mechanisms go down. And I think when you say science and religion, regardless of where you stand religiously or in what discipline you investigate scientifically or whatever you follow that makes you think this is my access to things, like beauty is something everyone has to cultivate to live a deliberate life. And when all of us, and I think at its best, science and the wisdom traditions of our globe are actually stewards of beauty. They actually help you live a more beautiful life, like the human flourishing thing you raise. And so sometimes I've had friends in the religion science conversation who minimize, it's to turn to anthropology and human flourishing, or we're going to turn to aesthetics. And underneath that, and I think that really what they want is some grant to prove they were right. But assuming humans are going to keep doing what humans have done forever, that's I guess if someone wants to play Sisyphus, that's fine. But apart from that, the question of beauty and can I be a more beautiful, insert how you locate yourself in the world, and can I contribute more beautifully to the world with the knowledge and such? That's such a different conversation. And when the 3 years I was working on the postdoc in science and religion and stuff in Edinburgh, where because of COVID, I basically ended up just giving people money that are running research projects to hang out with me on the internet and talk to them for hours and doing it for a while. I found that aesthetic questions make almost anyone, regardless of the religious tradition or not, what their scientific discipline are or not, because I was working on consciousness, which basically there's people for everyone. in every scientific discipline for that. The moment you ask a beauty or aesthetics question, you see the human light up, and then a scientist goes, well, can I speak as a scientist to say something about this? And then they decide. You ask an ardently religious person a beauty aesthetics question, they go, well, I have a real answer about what I really am, but should I speak as a Christian theologian or a Muslim scholar of science and religion? Like, what do you make of that phenomena? Because I experienced it over and over. And when I brought this up to friends at GTU, probably, I don't know what your dates were there, possibly some of your professors, they said they thought that was true, and it's even worse in the UK. So I was, but what do you think of that the aesthetic shift as more than performative to get people on the same page? It's actually more valuable.
Oh, it's so good, Trip. I love that. And the only danger is there's so much here that just gets me energized. But let me just say that I've been working on this question of the nexus of science, if you want to call it theology or spirituality, and art since 2007, I believe it was, when Tom Ord put together a program in Venice, Italy, called the Venice School on Science and Religion, and I started this project.
I'm bitter I didn't get to go.
Well, maybe
you hear that, Tom Ord?
It was amazing. I mean, I have to just say, we were sitting there with like George Ellis, the great mathematician, and David Sloan Wilson, learning about evolution and mathematics and beauty, and oh my goodness. And then going out at night and sitting in the piazzas along the canals and talking about this stuff. But it was beautiful. I mean, the thing was, it replicated the experience of beauty. And I would just say that, I love the connection the classic philosophers make between truth and beauty. Truth is what is that aligns with being, but beauty is what draws us. It draws our desire, right? And so why would you have truth without beauty? And I want to get back to apologetics, and well, let me do the apologetics thing just for a second. Because one of the things I haven't done much with, even though I respect apologetics, is to use science to prove a certain religious position. I think there's a place for interchange, but I'm going to offer that at the end of the day, even the most hardline apologist on either side, I mean, if you want to have two sides of atheism and theism, they want to find what's true and resonates and makes them feel I have a beautiful life, right? So, I mean, even Richard Dawkins, I didn't really understand him until I understand that he's a stylist of satire. Like, that's actually what gets him going, So let me just say one thing about this as a particular that right now I'm working on, and I think this could be a really positive nexus. So I'm a jazz drummer. I've been playing for most of my life. I played drums before I was ever a Christian, so improvisation is a part of my life. And when you take quantum physics, the improvisational universe that emerges from that, you take Christian eschatology and what Ted Peters, one of my mentors, taught me about how God is always creating a future. That's what creation is creating a future. Like, not to have a future is to die, right? So it's not just God creates from the past, but God creates from the future. And then you connect that with improvisation, which is creation in the moment. And you put those all together, I think you get something that is hopeful and beautiful. In other words, all of those have a nexus of hope, improv, and beauty. You're engaging with God, who's continually improvising the world at a quantum level, improvising a level of spirituality. And then with my experience as a musician, you're daring to improvise. That's how Wayne Shorter, the saxophonist, talked about it. You're daring to say, I'm going to do this. And one of the things about jazz, and this is why it's not individualistic, is improvisation is actually done in a group. You trust the people around you. You listen to them. You find out what they're saying. And you have this idea that if you jump out, if we can say in faith in a song, it's going to be better than what you would have planned because of the trust in one another and because of the beautiful interaction that happens in the moment. So I would just say, Trip, I think there's a lot here. in different here with beauty as a nexus point between, again, art, theology or spirituality, and science. And as you said, it lets a lot of guards down. Who doesn't want to talk about this motivation that draws them, right?
So the thing about improvisation, and I think this is true in almost all the arts. I was a theater and philosophy major in undergrad and went to art school for theater for most of, since I was in sixth grade. And one of the things you like get drilled into your head in improv is the only answer is because you have to say yes. Otherwise you kill the scene. Right. So, and I bet Will has an example of how this works with surfing, right?
Oh, like you don't get the words out of my mouth. I was getting ready to chime in and say, improv, that wave comes at you. You can't control the wave. You can only control how you react to the wave. So if you say no, the wave is over. But if you say yes and paddle in, drop in, you go, you're reacting to what's in front of you. That's always moving in fluid. So 100%. Yeah.
And I think like all those examples have this, it has a resonance with, at least for me, like in the education philosophy of process thought is like prehension happens every moment. Everything is showing up. So like the question has to do with whether what you contribute, your agency in the moment, is it aesthetically guided by the potential possibilities of what you have to say yes to because you don't get to pick another history, right? All of history in the way it's connected to you showing up. How do you value it? How do you judge it? And then of the possibilities, how do you ride it if you're thinking of a wave? And
how does God lure you into beauty through that, right?
Oh, preach
how is God always moving toward
lure
beauty?
You to beauty? Yeah. I know the Galilean vision is a little bit oblivious as to morals, but it has this hum of resonance, and it is, yeah. And Tripp's a little excited because he has the first game of the Lakers and Golden State on pause until we get done talking, and I'm just eager and excited to see how well LeBron's busted foot works. But when I think of beauty, it usually is in purple and gold, which I got my Lakers championship hat on. They haven't lost in quite a while since I've wore this. It's been at least 4 months when I watched the game with my hat on. They haven't lost. And I got my 17 championship koozie here. And I am a tribalistic partisan when it comes to Laker basketball. And so and I'm saying all that because as an academic, we can all put on these hats, right? Where there are all these religious traditions, there are all these different disciplines, science, all going on. But then they're also like, you're located somewhere, you are ordained somewhere, you show up somewhere, you told a community of faith about this book. As someone who is deeply invested in listening to the overlapping, but not always talking communities of science and religion, when you're in your congregation and your tradition that goes, yeah, you can baptize, serve the Eucharist, and marry people and bury them. Like when you hold this book, what's like the story or questions that are so contextually grounded, they bubbled up while you're working through this? Like Greg, the Presbyterian minister, not just the professor and such, like where are those things where you can't shake your tribal loyalty? Where you go, look, it's not personal, but I hope all the Celtics have non-threatening to their life injuries. And I laughed a lot when the Clippers lost in the first round again because they got a clip. And all that. That's only mildly performative. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, where's Greg's heart when no one's around beating in this conversation?
Yeah. Well, let me just say two things in a way there. One is that
it better not be about the Golden State Warriors. I know you're close to them, but just save it. Mouthpiece can wait till later. He's great.
I think LeBron James is a great player. So
let's just say that North Carolina guy.
The reason I think that men particularly, but many people like sports, is that you see beauty in action. that beauty is being done through LeBron James and Steph Curry. We got to include Curry in this. I mean, that in itself is a beautiful competition, right? But even more, it's like they're doing, beauty is alignment, right? It's doing what you're created to do. It's when things fit well. Thomas Aquinas used fittingness as a form of beauty. So I just think your image was actually really appropriate, whether we align with the Lakers or the Warriors or whoever else. But also, I think what you also said there, which is getting me to the answer, is I've learned from evolutionary psychologists that we think in groups. It's really hard for us not to think along with the people we're with. And I know your listeners understand this, but I'll just say it that it's much more important to belong to a group for survival than to be right. And so the reason that we think in groups is because it is advantageous to us. Now, of course, we can, vary that. So how do I think as a group, as a Presbyterian Christian, or I still love C.S. Lewis's term of a mere Christian, something that's been believed through the ages about Christ and his message. One of the things that I've seen resonate with science is when I can help people to understand that it relates to their spiritual life. And by spiritual life, I'm going to keep beating this drum of beauty, because why do scientists get into their work? And I will tell you that almost every scientist I've talked with got into their work because they loved nature. They love nature. So one time I was on a youth group backpacking trip in the Sierras, and the daughter of the youth minister that we were with was picking up rocks and showing them to her dad, who's also a geologist as well as a pastor, and saying, "Aren't these rocks beautiful? Aren't they? Look at the speckles on this one, the granite rocks," right? The point I'm getting at is she was doing what science is about, this love of nature. And so what I do often that I think I've seen resonate with people is, first of all, just to say, let's observe like the psalmist does or the scripture does at the beauty of God's creation, speaking as a Christian. Let's observe as a scientist does. Let's see how those come together. Francis Collins has talked about studying the natural world as a way to see the beauty and intricacy of God's creation. So that seems to be a very intuitive thing. It goes back to what we've been talking about. I think another way that I just did a class with a neuroscientist from our congregation named Leonard Matheson. He taught at Washington University of St. Louis for a long time, has moved to Chico, and it was on neuroscience and Christian formation. So to understand how this brain of ours works, how it relates actually not just up here, but throughout our whole body, like the vagal nerve goes all the way through our body, right? How that our gut, our heart, our mind can be formed, how neuroscience helps us to understand that. I found resonance there with people, but you've got to, I think for most people, help them to see that there is a connection with their lives. Now, for those like in my congregation or in Will's congregation who start with science, they can more easily understand, why science is important. But for most of the people that I talk to, they want to know, what does it do for the faith and the community that I'm a part of? So I see like connecting on beauty, connecting on the world around us and observation. We know that scientific studies continue to show that being in nature is good for us. Understanding how our brain is formed and why that helps us to create, a life that helps us to grow and to flourish. And then I think some of those, the bigger awe and wonder questions, sometimes you can get into the quantum physics questions, the weirdness of quantum entanglement or of, complementarity. Sometimes the questions of how is it that God is created through time, so that a geologist and an evolutionary anthropologist can help us to understand what it means that God created the heavens, the earth, and human beings. Those are the issues that I see within my tribe. And then how do they connect with Scripture, of course, which ultimately that's a form of our spiritual life that is enduring and is kind of necessary. So I suppose those are 4 different ways that I've seen connection points for my tribe.
Oh, that's good.
And then also thinking through, like, I think from like who parish pastor's point of view, when these questions come up and they trust Scripture, they're scared and fearful. The fear that arises to the service is this science going to disprove the sacred text that I've put my life into or hope into. But what our work has done or kind of exploring is that like the scriptures aren't a house of cards. You just pull one thing away, it all falls apart. That there's layers to the tradition. There's ways of explaining it, and so there's more than one way to interpret Genesis or these other stories that are coming through. Let's look at the diversity with that, and then also the practical nature of science is like it helped us emerge out of a global pandemic. Like we watch science in real time help us understand what the pandemic was about, and then we to how we tackle it together as communities. And of course, there was polarization when it came to it. But just to share like a brief story of like the positive thing that came out of the pandemic for us was that, you know, my church is on the doorstep of University of North Carolina, and there's about 8 churches there on Franklin Street, all side by side with almost the same block. You know, University Presbyterian, University Methodist, University Baptist, Chapel of the Cross. We're all there in the same vicinity, and we would gather once a month or so for lunch and check in as clergy to see how each other are doing. But man, when the pandemic hit, we all got on a Zoom pretty fast together to talk about how are you guys dealing with this? How are you keeping your congregation safe? How can we work together? Not that we all have to have worship at the same time or all have to do the same live stream or whatever, but we all wanted to be on the same page when it came to what science was saying is how we keep our members safe. And so there was a member of University Methodist who's director of emergency medicine at UNC, who was our weekly consultant on Zoom to share with us what was happening with this virus, how it was affecting others, how it was spreading, and then how we could keep each other safe or not. I mean, all those things, what was coming with the vaccines. And so for me, we were listening to the science and then taking it back to our communities to share how can we be good stewards of the relationships that we're entrusted with as we live together as a community of faith. Now, out of that, do we emerge and all become one big church, capital C? No, we still have our traditions. We have our tribes. The Presbyterians do their thing, Lutherans do ours. But we were able to have joint letters together about how we're taking care of each other through that. So for me, listening to the science, paying attention to watching how science evolves and grows and unfolds in real time, but also what our faith and sacred texts call to us and how we take care of our neighbor and those who are entrusted to us. So all those came together. And I think the part of your book where you talked about where that comes together is like in the hospital, you lift up, like, where does faith and science come together? Go to the hospital. There's science happening, taking care of people and their health, but you also have clergy, you also have chaplains, you have some family members that are there praying and holding hands, looking to something beyond themselves that hopefully will help them or give them hope for the future. But I share that because often we see that the COVID times, we saw deep division and polarization and politics and religion, all that got the clickbait up front of like how awful some traditions were being to one another and to science. But yet here there on our street, Franklin Street, and there are other accounts as well, how clergy in different denominations and Christian traditions came together to work together to pull those faith and science together, take care of our neighbors. So I want to lift up that are great examples of how they can work together as we work together as humans.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think the example of COVID is so important. And I would also add that one of the surveys we did with the STEAM project, Will, that you were a part of, was we went and we asked congregations, you know, what was it like before? What was it like after, right? That 3-year project. And the thing that we found as people brought together as congregations or other Christian groups brought together faith and science wasn't only that they understood science better, which we assumed they would, but they actually grew in faith. Like that was, I think it was 85% approximately of the people who responded said we grew in faith. Like, and so that helps me to say, you know, why do we do this work? Well, it's because we want to see churches grow, and we want them to engage in the world around us and use things like science for a deeper understanding of what Scripture is about, what creation is about, and really this gift that God has given us in science.
Yeah, it brings a richness, vitality to what you believe. It doesn't take away from or demean or disprove it. It for us, it brought an enrichment to it. And again, that's what Tripp's been doing with his podcast. And we don't want flat light beer. We want some zesty stuff. So
No, who wants
Some
that?
double IPAs for sure.
we want the double.
Oh, that sounds like a good man from California. You don't want it hazy either. You want it nice and dry. You want 3/4 of hops to start with the letter C. Columbus, Citra. Oh,
Exactly.
you can count Simcoe because the co is high. Anyway, all right.
Yeah, well,
okay.
that's a whole other conversation.
Oh, yeah. I'm just looking forward to us getting to hang
beer,
out.
I think is another conversation.
What? Say that again.
A beauty and beer is another conversation.
Okay, I totally heard Union beer, and I was like, oh, is this if we're transitioning to economics? I didn't expect this, but I support unions. May Day and all. Anyway, okay.
Yep.
Will, you have a task. Okay, I have 2 questions, and then I want you to ask a question, science religion related to Star Wars, because I think this it's important. All right.
Being May the 4th coming up this week.
That and I don't want to be more than one commercial break behind my catch up to the Lakers game. People have said,
well, are you going to bring up this whole new Wes Anderson version of Star Wars that AI has generated? Have you seen that?
Yeah, I think the possibilities. I'm not afraid with AI. They can bring me some different versions. We can do that.
I had podcast listeners ask AI my belief about all sorts of stuff, and there were things I've never said anything about, and I have no idea if it has access to 1,500 podcast episodes and some referential relationship to it. I'm sure it could piece it together, but I didn't think it has chronicled audio. But I mean, there was someone that asked AI about why does Tripp think, and then it listed like 5 or 6 people who I'm friends with are all wrong on the same issue, and it came up with something that's accurate.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
And I was just like, and I wouldn't have even thought about it. It was not even a topic. And then after it came out, I texted these individuals and was just like, I just wanted you to know you're wrong. And ChatGPT told me. But I didn't ask. It wasn't personal. I didn't ask the question to it myself. Okay. So quick question. Well, I don't know if this is true. It may not be quick. You can do whatever you want with it. But what is it like as someone who exists in a religious tradition, but with regular access to people, unlike, say, ministers or people at a seminary, or someone that is in an ecosystem of just largely their own kind? What did you learn by taking seriously the religion science conversation for the nuns? Were there what were the connection points if you bracketed, say, the nuns, not necessarily the militantly atheists, as a group? Are there particular questions that have resonance with people in religious traditions? Are there particular wisdoms from different religious traditions they benefit from? I think one of the things we don't know right now is what does the public square look like if both historic traditions and people that aren't nested get equal voice? And one of the things I loved about this text, and why I've already messaged quite a few people saying you should use it, is there are so few people that will feel left out in this book, and most of them I've muted on Twitter. So, but about the nuns specifically, especially assuming quite a few of the people here may be religious or nuns themselves and want to be heard. What do you think?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the nuns just resonate with me. I mean, I was a nun. That's what I grew up with. So it's always been a little bit odd for me to be ordained. Once I started the process of ordination, it took me 6 years before I finished it, because I just wanted to make sure, I really wanted to mark myself as a pastor. So the nuns, I think the key with science, and then I would include technology here, is that one of the reasons that the nuns or the spiritual but not religious don't want to use the label religion is often because of science. So because Christianity is still the predominant religion, and so often the loudest voice is the fundamentalist version, people are saying, I learned about evolution, or I learned about other forms of science, or I learned about scientific rationality, and this tradition of Christianity just doesn't fit with those things. So I'm not going to identify as a Christian. And of course, when I use that term spiritual but not religious, the key is, what box do you check, or the nuns even better, what box do you check when you asked what spiritual or religious tradition are you? And you check none of the above, right? So I think there's the first thing to say is that there's a lot of connection between science and that identification. I think the second thing that is part of this, which is technology, is that with the emergence of the internet, especially with iGen, those born after 1996, which my younger daughter is, they have had they've basically been cyborgs, you could say. They have outsourced brains in their pockets, in their hands, to help them understand a plurality of perspectives. There's a lot of problems with that in terms of whether those perspectives and voices are equally accurate. But one of the things it does is it says, and this is a question I asked when I did hour-long interviews with, I think it's 45 emerging adults, in addition to other surveys I've done. I asked them, where would you go to find out information about spirituality or religion and science? And they would say, I would go to the internet, right? So the point being, it's taken away the authority of religious figures. So fewer people are going to come to me as a pastor and ask, what do you think about, Genesis and the age of the earth? But they're going to look it up on Google or on other forums now, maybe ChatGPT, to figure out the answer to that question. And that influence of technology already pluralizes the response and says, wow, can I really identify with just one tradition out of all these different voices and say that's what I believe? So I think that that's another element that comes out of this. And that's why I think the nuns, or the as spiritual but not religious, using those terms kind of interchangeably, that they are saying, hey, technology has brought me to a point where I can't really say there's one religious tradition. And I certainly can't buy a tradition that invalidates the science I teach. I'll just have one more little statistic. We can also, of course, call the iGen Gen Z. And when Barna did their study of Gen Z and teenagers that went to youth group, so church-going teenagers, 49%, like almost a half, said, my church teaches me science that doesn't make sense, essentially. So you're talking about kids in church are saying, this doesn't add up. And when I meet the nuns and talk to them, they say, hey, that's where I really, lost the narrative with Christianity. It's like, I just can't adopt the hard-line Christian voice that I've heard. And so as a pastor, part of my work is to say, I think you can actually, still hold to the message of Jesus and all of, the consensus of mainstream science, but also as a professor or a lecturer in a secular university, I just love this dialogue. I mean, there are things that I get into that about truth. And when I say, give me your spiritual or religious background in an essay, and by the way, I read about 1 million words of student essays a year. So I read all these essays about, where are you with religion? They're telling me things that people won't tell me as pastors so often. Here's why I've engaged with science and it's brought me to this point spiritually. So that's the other side of this, about what I find about spirituality and science, or religion and science, through the nuns. And I just find that on just the level of curiosity, just a fascinating ongoing discovery.
Yeah. Oh, okay, Greg, this is a short aside. But I agree that people in your position, like, they have regular access to undergrad students, especially ones that are teaching classes that the individual didn't even necessarily choose. can we just get a grant to get like 40 of those people that have done it for years to go on a retreat with prompts, and then you talk about what you've learned from actually reading those essays? I feel like that is one of the gifts that the humanities could give the larger research program of this kind of reframing that you're describing. What if the conversations about being human are ones where the sciences and the humanities, which includes like all the different scientific disciplines, philosophy, and religious traditions, all come to the table? Like, people that teach the classes you teach hear what undergrad students coming out of whatever they were born, like in a family of nuns like you, to every version of religion, like those individuals have much closer access to what the actual experiences are of people becoming adults, and in the space where they don't already have cultivated how to lie / perform, or whatever you want to call what you learn as an adult, and want to know what they're going to do with their finitude, right? Like, college is so often, especially in residential colleges, where you go, oh, junk. You mean where I found myself in the world isn't the only option? Like, I regularly ask people if they love the podcast. I'm like, do you have an undergrad professor that was awesome that would come on the podcast? Because they're good. And it's not because they're like better humans. It's like literally they love wisdom seeking, and for whatever reason they personally became a scholar, and like you, a million words of people trying to figure it out. Like, how is that not something that Sarah Lane Ritchie, if you're listening, or whoever else that says yes to granting? I'm just saying, like, I feel like I have no idea why it's not a grant where you take those people on a retreat, you prompt them correctly, and then you go, like, as people that have listened to, if you get the right people there, thousands of people coming of age, asking the big questions humans have asked forever around campfires. What does that sound like today? Has it changed over your vocation? Blah, 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 blah. Texts that resonate. Just think of how many things we could come up with. It's nuts. It drives me up a wall. You know how many things I've seen given money to that no one cares about? Anyway, so.
And I'll say that, like, in terms of practicality for like churches and parishes, that like not a majority, but there are some who would look at the questions and curiosity within these students and young people and be like, nope, you shouldn't ask that. Nope, it's wrong for you to think that or feel that. But rather than be permission giving and the questions that they ask to validate the questions they're wrestling with and saying, this is a safe and brave space to ask those questions and wrestle with it. That makes a world of difference. So with our project, we started with defining terms, but before we even started terms, like, what are your questions? And guess what? We're not going to answer any of them tonight. And none of them are wrong. None of them are wrong questions. And this is not a bait and switch. We're not going to try to like tell you right or wrong about these questions. Like, we're generally curious what you're asking and wrestling with right now, and that's okay. And so you start there. I think that in terms of like ministers, youth ministers, whatever, don't get defensive with the questions. Don't feel like you have to answer them all. You have to have a PhD in science. Just sit with the people, sit with the students, sit with the teenager and say, man, that's a damn good question. And I'm going to sit with you through it. And I may not know the answer, but man, there's some books, there's resources that can help you wrestle with it, but let's just sit with that for a while. And that's okay. So become more curious with the question than you are with trying to get to the right answer at the very end, the quickest you can.
If I could just add to this, I think it's really important, Trip, if we were to put this grant together, and I would love to do that, by the way. I think
if I don't have to write anything and you can just put that I have a 70,000 person email list on it and I'll show up and be nice, I'm more than happy to contribute. You know what I mean? Like,
I love that.
The number of times I've written things related to grants to find out that my specificity is not appreciated. Yeah, but I've been a great contributor for the public component, and I'm a jovial extrovert that brings the people together. Even people that go to Biola and Claremont. Like, I've brought them all together and made them have fun and gone karaokeing and line dancing with Justin Barrett. So I'm like,
always a youth pastor. There you go.
There you go.
yeah.
Exactly.
Big time youth pastor energy.
Well, let me just say, I think pastors should also be listening for that. I mean, that's the one thing I tell my friends in the guild is like, you don't realize, if you read some of these essays, you realize some of the issues that I guess I'd say you're up against. I don't want to just be negative, but like, well, you said it really well, like to engage these questions, to have a place and openness and curiosity. And I know, Will, you have such a great way to do that. But I was listening to a scholar talk about this in a meeting I was at a couple of weeks ago. I think his last name is Von Tongeren, Daryl Von Tongeren from Calvin, I think it is. All I knew him by is Daryl, but he studies this whole nuns and duns thing. And he's like, the church is either going to die slow or it's going to die quick or it's going to change. And I think a part of me says that we need to learn from these social scientific studies and from the influence of science and technology, or else we're not going to know we don't know what we're doing as a church. We're just going to keep work harder and harder for fewer and fewer people. So I think it would be worthwhile for pastors also to hear this and to work within their ministry in light of why or how science and religion is connecting with people who aren't here.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do see in the chat, Christianity will never die. That's not what I meant. I hope I didn't say it. I didn't imply that. What I said, though, was that the church in America is in a dying trajectory, the way it's structured. And I think it has to be restructured.
Well, you know what I think? The moment I see a comment from first century Catholic, they must be socialist. Hashtag Acts 2, liturgical reading last week. But, that's just me.
Well, yeah, that's fine. I hear you, man. It was a friendly amendment, though. I don't want to, because
I understand, Greg. It was just me being snarky. I have a goal on all live streams because my editor regularly edits out 2 of Tripp's reoccurring topics. One, I can only have like one of intense Bernie Bros socialist rant.
I don't even know the punchline yet. This is just making me laugh. Sorry,
go ahead. It's just my Bernie Bros socialist Christian rant. I can only get one a month.
One a month.
Yeah. Well, maybe some others sneak through, but it's usually an edited version, right? By the end, I'm cursing about Morning Joe and the military-industrial complex, big pharma, and blah 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 blah. And the other is he'll cut out me discussing extraterrestrial life and Tripp's true believer status on extraterrestrial life and blah 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 blah. So and I want to say that all 4 people that have edited the podcast over time have inherited these prejudices where they're like, Tripp, you really max out on your discussion of this. But you know what they don't edit out? Star Wars. So I have a question after you ask this one. I may have 2. I don't know. But you're going to ask a Star Wars question.
Okay.
And then depending on how quickly he answers some of the chat questions, I have one more that is totally directed at the Divine Action Project at his graduate at his PhD source. So that is going to be the last question, is one that almost no one cares about but Tripp. Okay. So
all right.
Yeah.
All right, Star Wars. So, in terms of even though it starts off a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, it's seen as way deep in the past and far away distant. What I love about sci-fi is it holds up a mirror to the human condition, and in the sandbox we can play in about speculating what could happen in the future. And so, and then the reason Star Wars resonates with me, not only when I was 5-year-old when I first saw the Star Wars in the theater, first movie I ever saw, but it really does mash together faith and science, because you have religion and mysticism and spirituality right next to robots, lightsabers, spaceships, and hyperdrive and zip into one place to the next. So if you look at Star Wars as a whole, Greg, and you had to predict something that you think was going to be a reality in the near distance future, of whether it's tech or an issue or something that genre is wrestling with, what would you say, luring out there, that people would either be real, actualized, or another issue that people would still be wrestling with, 10,000 years down the road?
Well, I mean, I think there's one thing I did in the book I wrote before this, Negotiating Science and Religion in America, was I tried, by looking at history, what the next 11 topics would be in terms of importance in the science and religion debate, or not debate, discussion, excuse me. Maybe debate too, but discussion. And I think I would say there are two of those that come to mind. The first is a kind of disturbing one to me, so I don't mean to be negative, but I do think eugenics is going to be it's going to come up and be raised in terms of what happens in the future. And by eugenics, I mean the desire to see the human population get better and better. Negative eugenics would be the selection away from those people who are seen as not having positive characteristics, positive eugenics, having the breeding happen for those who have, positive characteristics as seen by whatever group sees that. And with CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing, we have such a high, we have a fairly reasonably attainable way of changing human genetic composition. Francis Collins, head of the NIH, he said a high school student in the garage can do CRISPR-Cas9, and that should scare you, right? So I think that's going to be an issue. And of course, I'll just say really quickly that in the last book, eugenics almost threatened to take over the whole book, because science in its worst form in the United States was used to oppress people, to, oppress particularly African Americans, but other people who were seen as not the perfect group, right? And we could go into that. So I think that's one thing that unfortunately is not going to leave us. I think the other thing that actually, if you were to ask me what is a topic in the book that I wish I could write into now, and I think the revolution we're seeing with AI is really significant. And for that reason, I would say, how are we going to work with what ChatGPT has brought to so much of our consciousness? And in that, here's the particular, is where is the soul, right? The Turing test, that test by Alan Turing in the 1950 itself, about what would make a computer or, replicate human dialogue, et what would do that? We have achieved that now, it seems, in many ways. And that's, of course, a disputable point. But the bigger point is, what does that mean about the soul? If ChatGPT could replicate something that we think is human, then what does it mean that sits inside this person or in my social relations? So I think that's going to be another question that I think is going to become even more present for us. Now, if you want to wring the economics of this, where are human beings going to be with the use of technology? We know that technology tends to get aggregated in the hands of people with lots of financial means.
Right.
So things like gene editing, things like the use of big data are going to be probably in a smaller and smaller group of people. And how are we going to create a society that's a good, beautiful society where there's human flourishing for the society as a whole? That, I think, is another question that is looming out there. And I'm, of course, not the first person to ask that.
Well, it seems like you've been following, I don't know if you're watching Disney Plus, The Bad Batch or The Mandalorian season 3, or what's going on with the new the new movies that are announced. But when you talk about like genetics and cloning and trying to create a super race, and then also like AI and like robot rights, whether it's being treated right or not, and then also going all the way down like the abuse of power and what that means. So it sounds like you're a true Star Wars fan, and all those themes are there, and cautionary tales in terms of whether we went on the right side, the good side of the Force, or turn to the dark side. So I think you're right in line there. So I'm very proud of you.
Well, thank you. And just so we can throw in one Lord of the Rings reference, I think what Tolkien saw was the way that technology was going to overcome a relationship with nature. So I'll say that in working with a speech coach and crafting a speech or a talk about science and technology, he said, what if you started with this question? Why is our relationship with the natural world so broken? I'm like, wow, that's a fascinating way to start a talk. And Tolkien saw that, right? What is Saruman? What's his thing? He's harvesting these trees, which themselves have a soul and a consciousness, just for the sake of creating a military industrial machinery, right? So, I think just to put in a Tolkien reference, that's another aspect of technology and science we've got to really have under in our thinking and in our behavior, so it doesn't get out of control, and we retain our humanity, which I'll just add this, that we learned from Native American traditions is all about our interconnection with the world around us. That's so important.
Sounds like a conversation on systematic ecology about like Ints and Arbor Day.
There we go. I love it. Yeah.
We had a good one.
Well, it makes me think of Waldrick.
But
My favorite thing about Rings of Power is there's only a niche group of people that even get references to it, so then they feel left out if you do it. But all right, so last two questions, and in this is really inspired by a couple of questions in the chat. Trisha had said, honestly, I ask, what do Christians do for us and the world? And the scripture is not understood by the church. I trust scientists, not the church. And then Carl said, are scientists the theologians of the first scripture, nature, and can help us explore truth and beauty and creativity? Like, underneath both of those questions is a shift that I think you do a good job tackling, where you hear even how it feels different in different traditions. When you look at the wisdom traditions of the world and your own experience as a Christian, how has the advent of science, scientific method, what we learn from it, how has it impacted the way the individual, regardless of where they find themselves in the world, but like how does it impact the individual, and what faith looks like? How does it change the terms of affirming something about some ultimate, right? Like I think Carl's question about the scientists as the theologians, right, of the first scripture, which is reference to like kind of that medieval image of the book of nature. And I think Trisha's question comes out where you've grown up in a religious context, and then you're like, who do I trust? And then you look at all these reasons, moral, ethical, and truth, where the church has failed you, lied to you, manipulated you, deceived you. You see a church, especially if you're an American, where are often the ones least likely to say, I mean, even referencing like vaccines are cool. Climate change, legit question. You go through all these kinds of things. And so when it goes to the question of trust, science in many ways, especially in the West, has a privileged function that and religious traditions themselves, because of that tension, have a variety of different responses. Like, what do you, I'm sure you've heard questions similar to Trisha's and Carl's before. Like, what kind of response do you have, and what do you think we gain when the framework isn't just a particular expression of a tradition, but the multiplicity of traditions in the way you frame it in the book?
There's a lot there, and I have that same deep respect for science. Even though I'm not a scientist, that's not how I come to these questions. It's partly I come to these questions wanting to engage science because I think science is so powerful, and it really does get us at things that are true, and obviously things that are at work. And we talked earlier about how science it obviously helped us in the COVID pandemic. I have never been so happy in a doctor's office as when I got that first vaccine. I thought, wow, this is amazing. So I have a great deal of respect and love for science. What I do think is also true is that, most people in the world are religious. And even as the United States and Europe get less and less religious, if you look at the globe is getting more and more religious. So actually we're on the opposite curve of the trend line for the presence of religion. There are, of course, 6 countries that have more nuns or non-religious people than any other group, but still the globe as a whole is getting more religious. So we have to say that most people are going to come to science from a religious framework. And I think the importance is, how can we do that? How can we have a collaboration between the two? And I think that's where this comes in. What I also then see, to that last part of your question, Trip, is, we want to understand what are the wisdom, what are the ways that we can take wisdom from various spiritual traditions. And I think that's where a multi-religious approach is helpful. I mean, I still identify as a follower of Jesus to the best of my ability by the help and guidance of the Holy Spirit, etc. But I understand how I can learn from a Buddhist and a Muslim and a Native American. And I think that by learning those things, and learning how to interact in this common world we share, I think that will create a greater strength. I don't think people are going to become unreligious as a whole. I think most people will stay religious or spiritual, and science is going to continue to be more a part of our lives. So we have to bring those together for the sake of the common good. I would just say one last piece, Trip, that I think is really helpful for us, as largely, influenced by modern science through Western Europe and through our own country. Once Descartes said that we are masters and possessors of nature, there was this trajectory where we got more and more distanced from nature. And what I see in learning from other traditions is a deeper connection with nature. In a way, if you were to take the message of Jesus and put it with Enlightenment philosophy, which I love and have learned a lot from, or put it with native traditions from our country, which one actually fits better? And it's not hard if you take a little time to recognize that first one, which I have tried to fit all my life and I've learned a lot from with a Enlightenment philosophy, works less well than with some of the native traditions, which emphasize community, connection with the earth, and all the kinds of things that actually the scripture of the Christian tradition is embedded in. So I think science, unfortunately, as we understand it, has helped us, or provided a block for us in connecting with nature. And as we learn from other traditions, maybe we can reconnect with nature, which is a deep yearning that I hear, especially from my students and those who are, 18 to 30 overall.
Yeah. Okay. Look, I want to go watch a basketball game, but I have one last question, and you can rearrange my framing however you want, because I have no idea how you land on this, because your nonpartisan writing of quite a bit of this book was a little irritating if I wanted you to locate yourself. You know what I mean? But it's great for basically using this book for what it was written for. Okay, now you're a GTU grad. The Science and Religion program at Graduate Theological Union is rather wonderful. Ted Peters, you've mentioned, Bob Russell, both have been on the podcast, and people can go check out our conversations and hear what they're up to. Now, so that was really the center for the Divine Action Project, which is a particular kind of investigation on religion and science, like assuming kind of broad, deep, rich naturalism, right? Not like a reductive one. How would you imagine the divine having any form of agency in the natural world without kind of breaking any particular rules that undergird its integrity? And there's some really cool it it is a really creative exploration, assuming a particular interpretation of quantum mechanics, and that is the best expression of that generation of religion and science. And this is true when I was moderating, in scare quotes, sessions at AAR, the American Academy of Religion, where even the critics of it are like, this is the most thorough version of what this kind of engagement of science and religion looks like, where it's very much here's a plausibility structure, here's a scientific data, how does that work, and then like in what places do we not violate this so that create a space, divine action, boom shakalaka. And honestly, the ontological priority of the future I find ultimately compelling in lots of ways. And Lewis Ford, great person to work that out. And later Marjorie Suhaki, if you're like a process fan and trying to hook up with it. That's the nerdiest side that 3 people will ever know. But that vibe of religion and science is so different from the heartbeat of what's in your work. And it sees the questions as something different than what's a good image? The operating system than to do constructive proposals from your tradition. What do you think is being set aside or gained by moving those constructive proposals to the side? Right. So the kind of multi-religious and post-religious framing that's here, that I think a lot of the new generation of religion science scholars are trying to do, it never gets to answering some of the questions that I imagine all 3 of us as clergy were asked. Theodicy, divine action, the incarnation, the resurrection, eschatology. Most of the constructive Christian doctrines don't get answered when we bracket those big questions. And yet, those people that know those big questions have their opinions and then are doing things in the present find what you're doing, I think, more attractive, at least the younger generation on a whole. Do you get what I'm getting at? Like, I don't know what to make of this, because Tripp's internal operating system is a tier of plausibility structures going through all the scientific disciplines that I could be persuaded with adjacent possibles. It's just not the Divine Action Project, because quantum mechanics for me doesn't function that way. But I actually think on my heart, like if you said, testify the truth that's within you, it would sound like that of a different variety. And yet, if you said, as a public scholar of religion and science, I'll sound like this. Does that make sense to you? And I waited for the end because I know how few people might even understand what I just said. But I am very confident that a lot of people in my generation of religion and science, and the people that were working on PhDs and graduate degrees with me, get it. And I mostly want to throw this up as a softball, maybe not a softball, but like a WTF. Yeah. Like, what do you do with that? Because if we aren't going to do Divine Action Project, then what is science ultimately contributing to our constructive proposals of our confessional traditions? Not that the Divine Action Project as an example of science and religion engagement. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. I think so. I mean, I'll take a shot at it since it was a softball pitch. Studying with Ted Peters and Bob Russell, they were my my people on my committee, along with, by the way, Michael Velker, who you've interviewed and I mentioned earlier. And these are all these great classical theologians in the sense that they're trained in doctrine and in philosophy and in the tradition of the tradition of European philosophy and American philosophy. So that material is such a part of my my formation. But I got my PhD in 1996. That's when I finished, and I just watched so much change. For example, when I interviewed Ted Peters for our own newsletter with Science for the Church, he talked about what happened when the neuroscientific revolution happened. Like that was such a key shift, and now we're looking at artificial intelligence. Of course, Ted and you, Trip, connect on the whole extraterrestrial, questions that are raised. What does that mean for Christian theology? So I guess what I would say is I love the Divine Action Project. I love asking, what does science tell us about how God works in the world? And even today, I published a newsletter on quantum theory and God's creation and improv that I mentioned earlier. But I also recognize, I think along the lines we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, that with improvisation, you've got to say an and to what's being given to you. And I recognize that there are these younger scholars that are bringing some new questions that are very different from the ones that I was trained in. And we need to engage those and to take those and their insights really seriously. So part of the formation of this book for me was to say, and this goes back to this earlier framework of multi-perspectival and polycontextual worldviews, is like, okay, I come as a Christian. Here's what I can bring. Here's how I understand let's say the nature of Jesus Christ, fully God and fully human, through Niels Bohr's concept of complementarity. Like, I've written books on that stuff, and I think it's really important. I think as Christians, we need to articulate our faith within scientific framework where applicable. But this book said, well, what happens in the world we're in right now? How can we, from any one particular tradition or from no tradition in particular, understand what these spiritual and wisdom traditions are bringing? And in that sense, I step back, and for me, it's a very Christian perspective. I get that from, say, Philippians 2, put aside your own perspective and look toward the interests of others. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but the idea being, we put ourselves aside, we say, what is it that you are bringing? And let's enter into conversation and work together for the betterment of one another and the betterment of the world. And let's use science and religion to do that. So I guess I'm always operating in those two frameworks, the Divine Action Project and other things that I've done that are more related to Christian teaching. That's, for me, the importance of the conversation I have as a pastor and as a Christian in my community. The side that this book represents is, well, how can I enter into a world that isn't universally Christian? How do I enter in a way that's productive and beautiful, ultimately? And I think, to me, those are part of that dialectic, is the way of living in the world that I find strangely challenging, but also improvisationally very engaging. And I hope at the end of the day creates, back to this idea of beauty, something beautiful and something really worthwhile to be engaged in.
Mm-hmm.
Well said.
Awesome. Well, Greg, I'm very glad Will connected us and we got to hang out. It's been a lot of fun. I am looking forward to when someone gives us a lot of money to bring in undergrad teachers from all over the globe that interact with students, to hear their engagement and read their own confessional on constructive, critical reflections on these questions. And I'm looking forward to following up on this part, because I really think the impulse of what you're doing, and then that kind of constructive impulse within religious traditions, is kind of a different framing or a different conversation that we don't know how to do yet in religion and science. We've learned how to do religion and science if we assume Christianity is normative, and you've said no, but what you haven't said no to is, I am devoutly centered in a confessional tradition.
Right.
Or you haven't said no to learning from people that engage in the conversation in other confessional traditions or different religious communities. And yet most religious traditions have deep commitments to say a itinerant preacher executed by the state in Second Temple period Judaism as the image of the invisible God, and that Brahman is Atman and Atman is Brahman are both ultimately confounding on the questing terms of empirical science. But it's not that they can't contribute to the kinds of questions you ask, right? That's one side of the science and religion thing you bring up in the book. But they can also be problematized or enhanced by the results of different questions there. And I think we're at a time where the engagement with the sciences and coming to grips with the nature of pluralism creates a new creative tension for religion and science. That if we figure out how to decenter God-splainers of the religious and anti-religious variety, we could have some really cool stuff. And so now I know your book's already out, but in my imaginary endorsement for the book, when I got done, is that what it does is that when you hear the phrase religion and science, what do you think of? Most people think of crossing their fingers or a closed fist. And what this book says is the new look, right, which is the subtitle, or open hands. But open hands don't change where your feet are centered, whether it's in a laboratory or a mosque or in front of tarot cards, or you're in a multi-religious home, or you're Greg who grew up with nuns and then became a Presbyterian, and maybe because God elected it. We don't know, but I really feel like modernity told us clench fist and crossed fingers. And this book is like, yeah, that kind of sucks if you're in for truth, beauty, and goodness. And that's why I actually find the religion science conversation helpful.
Yeah.
Is it makes a new space for human beings to ask again the questions we've been asking across traditions and cultures throughout human history around campfires, and to have externally verified yet interpreted through a multiplicity of metaphysics reference that can create connection points that aren't, no, this is what I read, or this is what I do on sacred moments, right? It actually could be a generative place for pluralism. And this book is, I think, hands the questions that have inspired those of us that are Christians and religion science scholars to a new generation that says, you don't have to be located in my tribe to join a conversation that could transform me. So welcome. And I'll just say, and this might be weird, but if you were a disciple of Jesus, what sounds more Christian than framing an intellectual endeavor that way? If you can invite the people that betray you and deny you to a table, then at least if you're just talking about physics, biology, and psychology, you might think you could learn something and other people are welcome. Anyway, so
oh man, so well
I love
said.
The book.
So well said.
I mean, in other words, you make what I said sound so compelling. I hope it's half that compelling when you actually read the book itself. Thank you.
You know what?
Those are really kind words. I really appreciate it.
Oh, I really do. I really enjoy the book, and also I'm not worried about people being depressed if they get it. But I'm just saying, if they've already got the book and they only get through a little bit of it, they'll never know. It wasn't as much fun as the three of us had talking. So I'm just saying, they'll look at it on the shelf and say, "Oh yeah, I love that." That was what I was. I was watching that live stream right before the Lakers beat Golden State in Game 1. Anyway, I'm gonna go catch up on the game. But thank you both for hanging out.
Yeah,
thank you, Trip.
Always great.
Been so fun.
It was fun
Good to see you again, Will.
Yeah, we'll do it.
All right.